Hello, and welcome back to the podcast Chez Romulus, where all roads lead to Rome, including the news. Today we'll be discussing influences of ancient Rome on the United States, and following that, an analysis of a new monument in Iran titled Kneel Before Iran, considering narratives of masculine power for both. I'm fortunate to have the opportunity for an interview today with Dr. John Serrati, professor at the University of Ottawa and director of the institution's Museum of Classical Antiquities. Hello, Dr. Serrati, and thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Very well. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
As our first question, I would love to know your thoughts on whether it's common for politicians or institutions to try and connect themselves to antiquity.
It's not as common now as it once was. In the 19th, 18th centuries, it was very, very common to make allusions to Greece, to Rome. Now, not so much. There are things which are happening, allusions to ancient Rome in particular, which are indirect, like the neoclassical style of the ballroom that Donald Trump is adding to the White House, things like that. But there's very little to show that this is directly influenced. It's just that's the style that Donald Trump likes. Like, yes, he wants to put his face on coins and build monuments. You could say that's influenced by ancient Rome, but he himself has made very, very, very few allusions to ancient Rome. And I don't think it's saying anything too controversial to say that he has not revealed himself to be a student of ancient history. So,
It's more of an influence or a legacy, you might say, than an explicit
indirect
conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And it does seem, though, in the West that, in particular, the political right wing, they really enjoy symbols of ancient Rome and the types of imagery that is associated with ancient Rome. Why would you say it has still any lingering appeal as a symbol, even if we're not discussing it explicitly?
About 8 years ago, I had an epiphany. I used to study, and I still do to an extent, early provinces in the Roman Empire, how the Romans projected their power. And I still very much am drawn to that. But I had an epiphany that so much in history revolves around concepts of gender, concepts of masculinity, concepts of femininity. I really think it comes down to that. The Roman Empire is viewed as a time of proper masculinity, and I mean proper in quotation marks. What is defined as proper often by people who are within the manosphere or who are on the far right, which are often the same thing. It's viewed as a time where men were men and they went out and they fought and they conquered, and viewed as a time of tremendous power, and also the narrative, which was really put forth especially under the big European empires, and is something that's only starting to break down in the 21st century. It's where what we now call marginalized groups, the narrative is that they knew their place. They accepted that they were conquered, and they saw, oh, the Romans are ever so more civilized than us, so we should adopt their civilization. So kind of where women and conquered people were slaves, where they all knew their place, and the hierarchy was therefore much, much easier to understand. But I think it really boils down to that it can be held up as almost the ultimate projection of masculine power. And because the Roman emperors held, and still till this day, hold so much cachet in history, where, what was the leader of Germany called up until World War I? The Kaiser. Tsar comes from this. Caesar was one of the titles of the Ottoman kings. So this has so much resonance into the modern era. But I really think it comes down to this idea of what is defined as proper masculinity.
Interesting. So it's not just the cultural legacy of Rome, but also the imperial legacy that these groups are really interested in.
Yeah, in fact, I would go as far as to say that, yes, there were people who had symbols of Roman and Greek, especially their idea of Spartan power. But these symbols, at the January 6th insurrection, they're almost always military. They're wearing armor, they're wearing helmets, they're carrying shields, they're adopting things like Mulan Labe, which they translate as come and get them, which resonate with ideas of ancient militaries. I think if you actually pulled any one of them aside and said, okay, how do you interact with, or what do you know about Roman culture? Do you know who Tacitus was? Do you know who Seneca was? Or do you know who Euripides was in a Greek context? I'm not trying to portray them as unintelligent necessarily, but that's not the part of they care about. They care about the military, and Rome is so deeply associated with the military. It's almost inseparable at times, the idea of the Roman Empire and the Roman army. Of course, we know that Rome was so much more than just the military, but it's really a visceral surface level thing for people in the manosphere and on the far right.
I think that could explain why some of the influences on, say, architecture with the new Arc de Triomphe that's trying to be put out, why something that's more military symbolic like that is being produced instead of, say, a monument to the Aeneid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, certainly. Which itself is replete with violence. There's so many allusions to war. And when you read it in Latin, the violence becomes even more striking in the Aeneid.
And the Aeneid also ties to this idea of virtus and pietas.
Absolutely.
That I think these fringe groups have just the bare idea of this ideal masculinity, but not necessarily the entire cultural context surrounding it. You also mentioned Trump using other influences, perhaps subconsciously, such as the coinage. Do we know how putting face on coinage worked out for Caesar?
Not well. Not well, right? He was the first living Roman to put his face on coinage. It was common for descendants to put their ancestors' faces on coins. So it was okay to receive that honor posthumously. Caesar does it for himself in his lifetime. And that comes with allusions, which I believe were direct on Caesar's part, to the successor kings and of Alexander the Great. So his empire in the 4th century BC, Alexander dies. His generals fight over it, but it's never reunified. So it breaks up into various successor states. Cleopatra is pretty much the last one of those. And I think she's not given enough credit. He takes a lot of lessons from her. And one of the things that these kings do is they put their faces on coins. And I think that is the type of government that Caesar was aiming for. And of course, for him, it comes with allusions to Alexander, because Alexander was seen by Roman times as a unifier. So that's what he's really going for. But he also doesn't think things through clearly enough that for the Romans, it doesn't contain that symbolism. Caesar's enemies are able to twist that and to say, look, he's aiming at monarchy. I think he was aiming at monarchy, but he was a little too overt about it.
Yes, I think even for a modern audience, faces on coins can be quite a clear reference to monarchy. We have on our coins in Canada, we still have the queen, or soon to be the king will be on
the king, yes,
on the coins. And it's not always necessarily just symbolic influences Rome has had on republics such as the United States either. What about the concept of res publica? How has that influenced our modern concept of democracy? How has it influenced the United States?
It's very clear that the founding fathers pictured themselves as a new Rome. You look at, they form a senatus, a senate, right? They have the obelisk, the Washington Monument, as a direct copy of what is being found in ancient Rome and also the Second Rome, Constantinople. We have the whole idea that they call themselves a republic. They picture themselves as a benevolent slaveholding society who can vote. Thomas Jefferson has this idea of the virtue of the small farmer. If you don't own land, you can't vote. It wasn't quite like that in Rome, but the votes of the proletarii, the class that didn't own land, they were very, very marginalized. They didn't count for nearly as much as those who owned land. And so there were elements of democracy in Rome, but it was slanted towards the wealthy. That's certainly the way the founding fathers pictured it. And then, of course, the eagle. And what is the eagle holding? The fasces, the bundles of rods that are the symbols of consular power in Rome. There's so many allusions to Rome in the early United States, but then it shifts. We get more of an idea of we're a democracy. The landless get the vote in, I believe, early the 19th century. And it gradually shifts to the idea that By the 20th century, and certainly by the mid 20th century into the Cold War, there's a vein of scholarship out there, particularly by political scientists, which really pictures the United States as Athens. That the United States has inherited the benevolent democracy that was Athenian. The idea of the small farmer voting, that becomes very Athenian. The idea is that we are the inheritors of the Athenian democracy, and that what the Athenians got wrong, like not giving women the vote, we have righted that. So we see this shift, and they move away from the concept of res publica, the idea that the citizen gets things from the state, but also owes something to the state, more to the idea of almost a radical democracy, that everything should be democratic, and more things are brought to the vote in the United States. And we see more plebiscites, more referenda in the United States than in most other countries. You know, when it comes time to presidential elections, midterm elections, we see so many questions get put on the ballot. And that's not something we are used to in a British parliamentary democracy. Referendums are very, very rare in our system. The United States definitely starts off with Rome in mind, but then they definitely shift towards Athens. Rome is making a comeback now, but definitely not in a democratic sense.
Yeah, it seems sort of symbolic of the old, more conservative world order. And you've touched a little bit on it, but considering that they wanted to move away from this republican system, how exactly was political power achieved and organized in the later Roman Republic?
It depends on when you're really talking about, but you know, the very late Republic, from a guy named Sulla onwards, it's seized. Sulla really sets the ground rules in that we have a system in Rome where there are frightening parallels to the United States, now many other countries too, where in order to win an election, to become consul, it takes so much money. It takes so much campaigning. And because there's so much riding on becoming consul, we get the introduction of political violence. Rome has no police force. Rome has no regular standing army at this time. So there's nothing really to rein in political violence for those who are prepared to use it. Sulla takes this further. There's a war going on in Italy with some of Rome's Italian allies. So he has an army in the field, and he gets a big command against an Eastern king named Mithridates. And everybody thinks, oh, great, we're going to go plunder Mithridates' kingdom. We're all going to be rich. So they want to go. And when Sulla is denied that command, he gets it at first, but then it's taken away from him. He goes to his army and he says, look, we're not going to get to go to Asia unless you follow me to Rome. And he marches on Rome and takes the city by force in 82 BC. That sets the ground rules. He has made the template. Marching on Rome becomes commonplace after that. And you look at, how did Julius Caesar take power? Yes, he won the consulship, but by Caesar's time, the consulship is symbolic. Nobody really wants the consulship anymore because the consulship actually has terrible things like rules and restraints. There's things you can and can't do with your power. What you really want is an irregular command. And so you see later on Caesar's great rival, but originally one of Caesar's allies, Pompey. Pompey doesn't really want the consulship. He only really wins the consulship once, and that's because him and his ally Crassus, who's also an ally of Caesar's, but this is a little earlier than Caesar, this is 70 BC, that they have armies parked outside of Rome, and they make it clear that you kind of have to vote for them or they're going to march on the city. So that the Senate appoints him to command. So that's really how power is achieved, is you kind of blackmail the Senate into giving you this extraordinary command, which has very few rules, which lasts over several years. Pompey manages to get a large command in the east. He ends up conquering large parts of Asia Minor, Judea from 70 to 67 BC. And then Caesar does the same thing. Caesar is able to use political violence with his friends, Pompey and Crassus, wins the consulship of 58, but then just takes it from there to get this irregular, extraordinary command in Gaul for the next 8 years.
So if I could interject a little bit for clarification, what exactly are these ideal restraints and limitations on a consul? What is the ideal way that a consul should be gaining and using power? What is this role supposed to represent?
So a consul has something called imperium, and that is the basis of his power. Imperium, there's not a really good translation for it, but it's roughly the right to issue orders and have them followed. But there are things you can't do with imperium. It is severely limited within the city of Rome. You can't command an army in the city of Rome. There's only so much you can do. You command a political assembly, you can propose laws to that political assembly, but you can't arbitrarily force through a law. You can't do that as a consul. In the field, you have a little more action because it's basically a war leader. You can order troops to do things. You can even order non-Roman citizens to do things. Whether they understand imperium is a completely different question. But there are certainly examples of Roman consuls demanding, say, food from a nearby city, saying that I have the right to demand this because I have imperium. But you cannot, for example, in most cases, you can't arbitrarily execute soldiers. You can't keep all the plunder for yourself. And then most of all, you're normally given what's called a provincia. And I don't like translating it as province for this time in Roman history, specifically because it's not necessarily a firmly defined area yet. It roughly means area of military command. Once the Senate assigns you that provincia, you cannot leave it. You cannot simply go rogue and decide, I'm going to pursue this enemy. You have no ability to make war. You have no what's called plenipotentiary power. You have no power to decide, I'm going to make war on this power that lies outside my defined provincia. Whereas an irregular command, Pompey makes the template that his command, he has the ability to make war and peace as he sees fit anywhere. He breaks the bounds of the traditional Roman provinciae.
And are there things within the Roman government constitution that allow for these irregular commands if they're not always seized? For example, what is a dictator in the classical sense? What is that kind of role within the Roman system?
It's during the war with Hannibal in the late 200s BC. Up until that time, the Romans had rotated consuls every year. Consul is an annual office. 2 are elected every year, and only 2. But they realize against Hannibal, this system is not working. So they enlarge the idea of extending imperium. So you're not elected a consul again, but you're given proconsular imperium. So that means your imperium is extended 2, 3, 4 years sometimes. And then this is the power that Pompey and Caesar have. They have that proconsular imperium. And by the time we get to the late Republic, that is much, much more common. That you get elected consul and then you just count on your imperium being prolonged for, in Caesar's case, 8 years. And more allusions to Rome in the early United States. The power of veto, right? That's something which the tribunes had in Rome, but also a president's immunity from prosecution. Consuls had that, and that's why Caesar wants to hold on to that consular imperium, because there's people in Rome who want to put him on trial for electoral corruption. And as long as he has that proconsular imperium, he is immune to prosecution. American presidents have that.
So it's not merely a greater term allowance, but also a form of absolutism, perhaps.
Absolutely. And you mentioned a dictator. That is actually a legal office in Rome. There were times in the distant Roman past, 4th century BC, where 2 consuls were not enough. They were fighting on too many fronts. So they needed a 3rd war leader. Or in certain times of emergency, a consul is killed in battle or dies of natural causes, and you need someone to step in. This happens quite frequently against Hannibal, because Hannibal, there's a year where one consul's dead, another consul's cut off from Rome, so you need someone with imperium. So the Senate can appoint a dictator for 6 months, and he has what's called imperium maius, greater imperium. So he can order the 2 consuls around. But it is an office which lasts for 6 months, and it is legal. It is not something which someone seizes. It's legal. And then this is the office that Julius Caesar is going to try and make permanent instead of calling himself king.
Very different from, I think, our modern understanding of the word dictator. And it's certainly telling how Julius Caesar ends up using it. I believe he uses the title Dictator Perpetuo, meaning permanent dictator. But he carefully avoids Rex or king. And I was wondering what you could tell us about this choice of terminology, why he would avoid calling himself a king.
The Romans, by the late Republic, believed that they had a natural hatred of kings. In reality, this only goes back 100 years, but they believed that it went back to the very early days of Rome when they had kings and they got rid of them. There's really no anti-monarchical sentiment in the 4th century, in the 3rd century. We get a king from Syracuse in Sicily who gets the title Amicis Populi Romani, friend of the Roman people. And there's no problem whatsoever. But then when they start fighting more against those successors of Alexander in the 2nd century, then this develops, oh, well, Rome has a natural hatred towards kings. So Caesar, although I really believe that he wants to institute that style of monarchy that he learns from Cleopatra, there's no way he would ever call himself Rex because it comes with such terrible allusions to absolute power and things like that. It would be suicidal for him to do that. Similar to, there's been lots of talk about Trump going for a 3rd term. He would never change his title from president because president is steeped in American history. So Caesar chooses a term, dictator, which is legal and steeped in Roman history. And then his successor, because of course Caesar is not around that long, his adopted son, but by blood his great nephew, who comes to be called Augustus. Augustus is of course a title. Augustus takes this even further. He chooses all of his titles. One historian who's writing a couple of hundred years later, Cassius Dio, he says, for all intents and purposes, Augustus was a monarch, but he uses titles which are steeped in Roman history. Augustus, it basically means Holy One. It had never been applied to a person, but an object was called August or Augustus. He uses princeps for citizen, where we get our word prince. That's an old title. Praefectus moribus, the keeper of public morals. Like all these things have histories behind them. This is a way of showing, look, nothing has really changed. This is just a continuation of what we saw in the Republic. And I think we will certainly, if, God forbid, the American presidency moves much more overtly into single-man rule and abolishing term limits, I have no doubt that it will be couched in terms which have a deep resonance in American history.
Yeah, it's the use of this sort of Republican language to provide almost a facade against the type of rulership that's occurring. And I think the Americans, they're certainly very famous for their aversion to royal authority themselves. They founded their republic on rejecting the British royals. But at present, it does seem that despite Trump's similar avoidance of king-like language, that they are still rejecting it domestically. Wondering what your thoughts are on the No Kings protests since Trump's 2nd term began.
I think there's a strong sense in the United States that there are dangerous things which are happening, where the executive is seizing a lot more power. The presidency is seizing a lot more power. Now, it would be incorrect to say that this started with Donald Trump. The executive has been getting stronger for quite some time, and both Democratic and Republican presidents have strengthened the office. That said, I don't think it's controversial or radical to say that it has been taken significantly further over the last year. It's fascinating, possibly frightening, that people talk about the omega effect, which is sometimes called the horseshoe effect, right? Because the Greek letter omega is shaped like a horseshoe, and it's where two people or two groups of people start from completely different ends of a political or cultural spectrum, but they end up meeting in the middle. And we do see this on the far right, or possibly just the right, but we certainly have that idea of the Tea Party. No kings. We will not have monarchy. And they view that we are acting against the tyranny of the left. And then we also get the no kings on the left. and the idea that they're acting against the right. And in many ways, they meet in the middle in thinking we don't want a monarch. Now, I think we haven't heard much from the Tea Party lately, I think largely because they're all in power and they've achieved their goals. But as we've seen, so many movements in the United States have taken the language, which is steeped in American history, as we said, that if a third term becomes possible or a third term is seized, we might say, I have no doubt that the language surrounding that third term will be steeped in the Constitution and it'll still be called a presidency. Very similarly, the people who are against this, who, far as I've been able to tell from speaking to friends and colleagues in the United States, encompasses, it's not just the left, it's both people on the left and the right. They as well are taking language which is steeped in American history, the idea of no kings, the idea that this is not what our founding fathers intended. So I think it's fascinating that both sides invoke the founding fathers, but in very, very, very different ways. They both have different pictures of what the founding fathers were. And quite frankly, I think they're both inaccurate because the founding fathers were slaveholders. The founding fathers believed that people without land shouldn't vote. They believed that women shouldn't vote. And it was a very, very limited democracy.
There's this contrast, it seems, between using the plausible deniability of founding language to assert that, no, don't worry, there's no kings. But then on the other side, you have the idealism of what America represents, and perhaps it didn't fully represent in the past. And it makes me wonder how, despite Julius Caesar avoiding the title king, those in ancient Rome also contested and had their own conflicts with his rise to king-like power. In fact, we've just passed the Ides of March, the 15th, which is quite an important anniversary. And so I'm wondering if, in that spirit, you could tell us a bit about the domestic opposition to Caesar's rule.
I do bristle at comparisons between Julius Caesar and Donald Trump. As we said, I don't think it's saying anything controversial to make the point that Donald Trump has not shown himself to be a student of history. That doesn't seem to be something he's very interested in.
And there's a danger in aggrandizing, I think, in assuming a level of knowledge and
absolutely
Machiavellianism that perhaps isn't there.
But because Julius Caesar, he wrote a tremendous amount, and one of the things he wrote, which survives in fragments, is something called the De Analogia. It's a book on Latin grammar. So Caesar, yes, he was extremely violent. We can't hide those things. He enslaved and killed tens of thousands of people in Gaul. He could be very brutal. At the same time, he was a deep intellectual. Now, in terms of where the domestic opposition is markedly different from the United States, is that the domestic opposition to Julius Caesar were aristocrats who saw their power fading in front of him, and they wanted the system back where they were on top. Their version of the Republic was the Senate has all the power, the people don't really have any say, and the rich people just tell everybody else what to do. So the people who murdered Julius Caesar, Brutus and Cassius, that's the type of republic they were trying to bring back. It's very different from the No Kings protest, which is saying we need to hold on to our democracy. We need to rescue our democracy. Brutus and Cassius wanted anything but democracy. For them, it was very much an oligarchy. The domestic opposition, it was really a power struggle between aristocrats, because Caesar was, of course, an aristocrat too. They all knew each other, right? There was no equivalent to the people going into the streets. I might walk that back after saying that, because after Caesar was murdered, the people did go into the streets, but because they loved Caesar and because Caesar had given them things and had provided for people in many ways. Now, of course, you can argue that it wasn't very altruistic. It was very Machiavellian of him. He wanted the support of the people to gain more power. Those arguments have all been made and they do have merit, but certainly he did do certain things for the people to get job creation programs and things like that. So the opposition to Caesar was very much aristocrat on aristocrat. We do not see the average everyday American who is just struggling to make ends meet out on the streets in a no kings protest. We don't see any equivalent like that in ancient Rome.
So there isn't that same ideological
No.
component that we would see. And it almost seems inverse the type of popular appeal that,
Yes.
that Caesar could have had. And we also know that Caesar's empire survives his assassination. You've mentioned his son Octavian, Augustus, and successive emperors. Did they also continue to have this political strife, these contestations to their power, or was it relatively solidified?
No, they had lots of civil wars all the time. Julius Caesar's assassins seem to have believed that if we simply kill Caesar, everything will go back to the way it was. But all it did was create a power vacuum, which was filled initially by three men, Mark Antony and Lepidus and Octavian, and then eventually by one man, Octavian, who then takes the title Augustus. But Augustus never solves the problem of Rome is a violent state. It is an aggressive state. And if you can get a part of the army to support you, normally because of financial means, you bribe them in essence, then they will march on Rome with you and try and seize the emperorship. Especially when, one emperor dies and then there's a transition to a new emperor. That's always an uneasy time when you may have civil war. And the Romans go through a year with 3 emperors, a year with 4 emperors, a year with 5 emperors, and they never solve this problem of generals acting in their own interests. The best an emperor can do is say, I've got most of the army behind me, and the Senate's loyal, I've got lots of resources, so if you want to take me on, bring it on. Come. But you're going to suffer in the process. And most people are going to back off. It's only when they smell weakness, there's a weak emperor, or there's a new emperor. We're more used to the idea, what really starts in the Middle Ages, where you have that idea of the divine right monarch, that a monarch is a monarch because he has been chosen by God, right? Of course, that has a lot to do with Christianity. Then it becomes a religious crime to turn against the monarch. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It did, but it was rarer. But Rome is such a violent state. When you live in that kind of violent state, violence is not like a tap. You can't just turn it off and no more water comes out. And if the army is not given enough chance to conquer and plunder, then they may fall victim to a new paymaster and may say, yeah, we'll support this guy. And then it gets out of control in the 200s AD and eventually leads to the fall of the empire.
So it's very important for the stability of the Roman government that this image of power and of control over the army is maintained. An emperor, his ability to effectively bribe or inspire soldiers, that carries a lot of bearing on their loyalty to him as well as the state,
Yes.
you might say.
But he can't push them too far, right? He's got to take them on a campaign that has the right degree of difficulty, because if he pushes them too far, then they might rebel against him. But if he doesn't take them on campaign, they do expect to plunder. Some people have made the argument that the Roman army of the imperial period, so Augustus and afterwards, should really be seen as mercenaries. I think that's pushing it a bit too far. They do have Roman equipment. They are run by Roman rules. They have Roman paymasters. But still, yeah, every emperor is most concerned with the loyalty of the army. That is the thing which takes up the majority of his time, is making sure that army stays loyal.
And I imagine, too, that this primary concern with ensuring the army's loyalty must have made it really difficult for emperors to manage defeats. Let's move on now on that thread to our next point of discussion and get some context behind the new Iranian monument, Kneel Before Iran. In antiquity, the region we know today as Iran was a longtime military adversary of ancient Rome, and we know that the Roman Empire suffered a lot of defeats, waging war in the 3rd century CE especially. Can you tell us a bit about the challenges that Rome faced during this time of war, including how that might have impacted military loyalty?
Yes, one of the first instances where a Roman legion openly disobeys an emperor comes in the late 100s at the siege of Hatra, which is now in Iraq. The emperor Septimius Severus, they make a breach in the wall, and he prevents them from flooding into the city because he wants to try and preserve the city. After that, when the city doesn't negotiate with him, some of the legionaries just say, no, we're not going back. We breached the wall. No. And this is such an open and defiant disobedience of an emperor. So that is an example I always use with my students. It's been said the Parthian Empire, which is the second incarnation of the Persian Empire. So it's not quite the same empire which fought against the Greeks in the Persian Wars, that Rome liked to portray that it had a Parthian problem. But in reality, the Parthians had a Roman problem. The Romans were far more aggressive to the Parthians than the Parthians were against them. Now, that's not to say the Parthians were lambs and the Romans were wolves. The Parthians as well went through periods of aggression where they did attack the Roman Empire. That's true. But the aggression definitely went more from west to east than east to west. And it was always difficult for the Romans. The Romans could not operate much beyond Mesopotamia because the center of the empire was, of course, Italy. And even with all the great resources of the East, Asia Minor, Egypt, Syria, Judea, it was still difficult for the army to operate that far from home. Once you leave the Mediterranean, all of the supplies are being brought over land. That makes your supply chain much, much longer. And we're talking about an army of, 60, 70, 80,000 men would be campaigning against the Parthian Empire. All of these men have to be clothed, fed, simply the leather it takes, the amount of cows that have to be slaughtered and their hides tanned for that many thousands of men is astronomical. Once you go beyond the Tigris, it becomes very, very difficult to keep that army supplied. And it was only done a few times in Roman history. So for the Romans, it's more of a logistical problem. Their center comes to be too far away for that type of campaigning. On top of that, the Parthians were not some sort of local tribe that had, 10 or 20,000 people. The Parthians themselves were a well-organized empire with a constituted army that had a lot of infrastructure. For the Romans to try and take that down, it would have been a step too far for them. And the Romans actually did face a lot of crushing defeats in Parthia.
I think that certainly helps to explain why they were struggling on these campaigns, but could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the motivations for such campaigns, knowing the kinds of logistic issues that they were facing? Is it tied back to this idea of virtus, of wanting this sort of masculine pride? Why go on such costly and difficult campaigns if it is a threat to Roman power?
I think it has a lot to do with virtus and that projection of masculinity. The emperor always has to prove himself the most masculine. He is supposed to be seen as the manliest man in the entire empire. And going to war is the ultimate display of masculinity for the Romans. Roman emperors are often looking for campaigns, particularly at the beginning of their reign. As we said earlier, the army might be unstable. You want to stamp your authority on the army. You want to say, I'm your commander-in-chief. Don't mess with me. We're going to go and I'm going to conquer this place. Not you, me. So we get a lot of campaigns which happen early on in an emperor's reign. But then there's the extra added feature with Parthia, Alexander. Right? The Romans mythologized, romanticized Alexander the Great. By this time, Roman emperors have this idea of empire of the world, universal empire, imperium mundi is what they said, right? So they have this. Alexander also had that because the Persian kings originally had that. The idea that the Greeks in the Persian Wars, they simply referred to the Persian king as the king. He is just simply the king. We often translate that as great king. Alexander really wants to be seen as a successor to those Persian kings. Then certainly Caesar has that in mind. So that idea of universal kingship gets transferred to the Roman emperors. So when you can wage war against the Persians, you are marching in the footsteps of Alexander, and you are saying, I deserve to be at the top of the hierarchy. Not only am I the most masculine and I'm projecting my virtus into the Persian Empire, but Alexander was romanticized as the great unifier of peoples. And so I deserve to be at the top of this unity because I have inherited my power from Alexander.
Sort of an affirmation of their legitimacy via this military success, which is great if you're successful, but that doesn't always seem to have been the case, especially as they kept receiving all of these defeats in the 3rd century. I'm wondering what that can tell us about the king Shapur I. Around modern-day Iran, after the Battle of Edessa, he captured the Roman emperor of the time, Valerian. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit about this event, how it would have impacted not only Valerian's image as emperor, but the idea of Roman imperial power as a whole?
Yes, it has a huge effect both in the Parthian Empire and in the Roman Empire as well. With the Parthians, they make great propaganda out of this because the Roman emperors still have that mystique about them, that this is Rome, this is an empire which has been around hundreds of years, and you've now not only defeated that empire, but you've captured an emperor. That's massive. And so we see he does make statuary, seals, coinage of the submissive Valerian. Oftentimes, it's not on all of these, but you've got the captured Roman standards and then the submissive Valerian in front of Shapur, who is on a horse. This idea that, you have defeated what is now the great king. This is huge. And on the Roman side of things, the idea of the emperor as the most masculine has really been declining in the 3rd century because we get that it's an era of civil war. There's lots of people marching on Rome, and that the citizen class has become so well off that most of the time they're having fewer children and they're not serving in the army in the same numbers. The army is made up largely of people now who are from outside of Italy. We don't get that same drive to serve in the army. So the idea that the Romans themselves have abrogated their own masculinity, and that gradually in the East, the Parthians are showing themselves to be more masculine than Roman. And then in the West, it's gradually becoming more and more the Germans. So the defeat of Valerian in 260, it really, really was a knockback for the idea that the emperor is the most masculine and that the Romans themselves are this hyper-masculine warlike people. That is really on the decline, and it almost sends it over a cliff after the Battle of Edessa.
And you mentioned that the Parthians, they made a lot of propaganda about this. How would the king have marked this kind of achievement? What sort of commemorations or celebrations would have been used to cement this as not only a Roman defeat, but a Parthian victory?
As I said, he certainly propagandized the victory through statuary, through coinage. There is some evidence to say that the Parthians, that they in some ways imitated the Roman triumph and had triumphal processions, that the king Shapur really used this as symbolic of his power, that now he had defeated not just an emperor, but the emperor of what was once the greatest state on earth. And now can that title be transferred to Parthia? And then certainly the Parthians, from what we can tell from their imagery, they do seem to be aware of this previous Persian Empire that was brought down by Alexander the Great. And this idea that Ran, which is a term for the land which goes back thousands of years, that it was a great state and it was a masculine state and it was a conquering state. And this defeat of Valerian now proved it. Shapur puts forth the idea that we have arrived. We are now here. The Persian Empire is reborn, that we are back.
And just as they were drawing on this idea of ancient victoriousness, masculine achievement, it seems that there's still a place in historical commemoration for this in Iran today. Just last November, the new monument, Kneel Before Iran, was unveiled in the capital city, Tehran. And the bronze statue depicts the vanquished Roman Emperor Valerian kneeling before Shapur, who's on horseback. Looking at the image of the statue here, Dr. Sarati, would you be able to offer any insight about the historical iconography of the statue or how it would draw on historical styles from the period?
There has always been in Iran a very deep tension. On the one hand, from speaking with Iranians, the Iranian people are very aware of their history. They're very aware of their Persian culture, their different language. They see themselves as a people that can trace its history, its very clear history back perhaps even 5,000 years. At the same time, the tension is that Iran is an Islamic country. So things which happened before Muhammad are often very, very downplayed within Islamic countries. History really starts with Muhammad, and history starts with Islam. And then everything after that is history. But before that, given the same importance in many Islamic countries, often is that recollection of ancient Persia, of ancient Parthia, even though it is pre-Islamic. So, but there is that tension that, no, we're supposed to really emphasize things which are Islamic, but we also have this great pre-Islamic culture. And now we see with the statue, Kneel Before Iran, that this is being taken to another level by the Iranian government. Specifically, I think they are making a lot of classical allusions because they really have to cherry pick a point in history where they were clearly superior to the West. Now, what we call the Middle East today has a long and rich history going back to the Near East and Sumer and Mesopotamia, and then through, of course, what Europeans call the Middle Ages and the Islamic empires, where scientific technology and mathematics really took off. But again, just like we talked about with the January 6th insurrection, people there, they don't care about Seneca. They don't care about Tacitus. They don't care about the Aeneid. The Iranian government, it's much harder to say, we were doing complex math. That's much harder to illustrate, and they don't care about that much. Give us the military victory. So it's very much, again, we return to this idea of masculinity, and where can we show we are more masculine than the West? Shapur, Edessa, 260. We can hang our hat on that. Yes, we've got amazing scholars, amazing mathematicians, amazing libraries, but those are not considered to be hypermasculine things. Where are we going to find this? We're going to find this in war. And that is why they choose that time, because again, we even still to this day, we have that equation between war and masculinity.
And I think it's a very clear masculine image seeing King Shapur on this very resplendent horseback while a Western emperor is kneeling before him in supplication. I think it provides a very clear image. And like you said, a way calculus wouldn't.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
And I have to ask, though, I think especially for settler society in Canada, it can be a bit hard to conceptualize the idea of such vast history that people can draw on. The 3rd century CE was a long time ago, to say the least. Can such ancient history really still carry cultural, political significance for the average modern person, the average modern Iranian? Why build such a large, expensive monument so many centuries later? What's the value of ancient history instead of drawing on some sort of modern moment?
I think because now we're living in a period where the United States and Iran have been in opposition for a very long time. This is a generational struggle, and it's not something that we've seen or can really conceptualize that much. To think for me that, I remember what was called in our media the Iran hostage crisis. I remember that as a little boy. And so this antagonism between Iran and the United States has been going on for decades and decades and decades. And in the 80s and into the 90s, and I'm not a modern historian, but as far as I can tell, that Iran, it viewed its enemies more as its Arab neighbors. That conflict with neighboring states was far more likely than was conflict with the United States. Conflict with the United States has become much, much more frequent. So now we find ourselves in a situation where the amount of military contact directly between the United States, because Previously, it had always been indirect. We always saw sanctions, or the Americans would act through proxies, often Israel, right? But now we see direct American intervention. We see direct rhetoric and talk about war on Iran. A lot of people have made the comment that if you want to get Iran's back up, talk about war with them. Because there are democratic movements in Iran, but from reading Iranian sources, the ones I can find in English, these voices are being silenced because there is an idea that everyone needs to rally around Iran. Now, all Iranian citizens need to resist this. So the American strikes are actually having a counterintuitive effect. It is actually quashing democracy movements because people are saying, oh, the Americans bombed a school. Everybody has to link arms and we have to get through this crisis together. 70s, 80s, into the 90s, they're focused on their Arab neighbors. But now the United States has stepped up in a much, much more direct way. And the rhetoric is there. And of course, direct action is there. And that's why I think Iran is far more zeroed in on the United States than at any other point in their history. And I think that, more than anything, explains the Kneel Before Iran statue. That's why they chose that moment, because this is not a local neighbor. Valerian in that statue is symbolic for the West.
I think, as we've discussed earlier, even if they're not always explicit, the United States does have many allusions to ancient Rome, and they are very influenced by it. So I think it makes sense as symbolic of the Western conflict with Persia, Iran, Parthia. And if we consider the context of this current war between the American Empire and Iran, there's been bombardment on Iranian cities, including Tehran, since February 20. Do you think that the current conflict changes how the average person will interpret this statue or this historical moment? Do you think it carries the same meaning that it would have a few decades ago before the conflict ramped up?
That's more of a no. I think a lot depends on how much longer this goes on. I can see the statue taking on greater meaning for the regime. For the average Iranian, I can see it taking on greater meaning. At the same time, I can also see the opposite, in that I can see average everyday Iranians blowing off this statue, because when you live in a dictatorship, one thing all monarchs, dictators who are not constitutional monarchs, autocratic rulers, all of them want to be seen as legitimate. So they all do things to advertise their legitimacy. Might be drawing up a fake family tree. They often do it through art, through statuary, through literature. And oftentimes these things are grandiose. Look what I can build. Look at the palace I have. Look at this colossal statue that I can make. So once people see that enough, they kind of become immune to it. They go, oh, well, it's just another thing the regime has done. I can see both. I can see this taking on more resonance as the conflict goes on, but equally I can see people saying, it's just another symbol that's been put up by this regime. I remember visiting Tunisia when it was still under the dictatorship of Ben Ali, and you became immune very quickly to pictures of Ben Ali because his image was everywhere that you ceased to notice. And so I wouldn't be surprised if it's that as well in Iran.
That's certainly interesting to think about the role that ubiquity can play. It seems a delicate balance for people in power to achieve. I think we definitely have a lot to think about thanks to this discussion. I know I've learned a lot. My sincere thanks, Dr. Cerati, for your time and sharing your expertise.
It has been my great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure meeting and speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Dr. John Cerati, Professor of Classical History and Director of the Museum of Classical Antiquities at the University of Ottawa. If you'd like to learn more about Roman political power, his book Money and Power in the Roman Republic is a fascinating read. Thank you for listening, and I hope your road will lead you back to Chez Romulus next time.